Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, I have to tell you I'm a professional yapper. Now I have this memory from a year and a half ago where I was studying my A-level psychology class and something about the topic of siblings came up. Our teacher asked how many of us were only children, and out of the 30 of us or so, only 2 of us raised our hands, and I found that quite shocking. I don't think it was an accurate representation of the amount of only children in the world though, because before sixth form in my previous school, I'm pretty sure at least half the class were only children. Anyway, this girl sitting next to me made a comment saying, "Oh, but you're pretty normal." And I thought to myself, what, only children are supposed to be abnormal? It was crazy to me because I'd never known that people found only children weird. That's probably because all my best friends are only children. I'm not sure if I've attracted only children my whole life unconsciously or if it's just a coincidence. Not to say I haven't had friends that aren't only children. Anyway, it got me thinking about why people thought of us as weird, and I started to dig into it. This video is basically a long commentary of me trying to defend us only children to the ones who aren't. What makes us different from you, and more importantly, what makes us the same as you? Quick disclaimer, whatever I say in this video excludes exceptions. There are so many only children that have traits that make them stereotypically more like non-only children, and children with siblings who have traits that make them more stereotypically like only children. Anyway, let's get into it. I'm going to talk about different experiences from only children on the internet and a few of my own, and hopefully debunk a few stereotypes. A comment on Reddit from a 6-year-old said, "I heard about this myself all through my childhood. It was assumed I must be selfish, spoiled, mean, and unworthy. I eventually learned to evade being discovered that I was an only child because many would dislike me for that. I told them I'm an only and they reacted astonished with the proverbial, 'But you don't seem like an only child.'" When people think of only children, I think the first thing people stereotype is that they're very spoiled. And this might be what makes people who don't want to be friends with only children not be friends with only children. However, I think it's naive to think that all only children are spoiled without knowing the economic status of their family. People might stereotype only children as rich kids, and that might not be the best generalization because sometimes people have only one kid to save economically because they can't afford more than one. And sometimes people have only one child due to fertility issues, which is also completely unrelated to being spoiled. Yes, you can get an only child with a higher economic status spoiled, but you can also get a child with another sibling from the higher economic status family just as spoiled. I think being spoiled has more to do with the economic status of the family rather than the sibling dynamic. However, stereotyping people with higher economic status as spoiled is also pretty wrong in my eyes. There are so many privileged but humble people I've met my entire life, so it's just way more complicated than not having siblings. A comment on YouTube had a really good perspective. "I think people get the idea of being spoiled because toys, gifts, and money aren't divided. And as an only child, I don't find it reasonable to share considering you don't know how others will take care of your items. How many times have people with siblings complained about how things were taken and abused, and they had to tolerate the destruction of their property because they had a brother and a sister or more? No one likes sharing because people don't care about things that aren't theirs." So this person says that in their perspective, generally people just don't like to share unless they know the person they have to share their things with well. I kind of agree with this. Only children might be less likely to share their things with strangers, but so will people with siblings. What people miss is that children sharing things with their siblings is not the same as sharing your things with a stranger. People grow up with siblings, so you know them well enough to know how trustworthy they are, so be more likely to share with them. Therefore, more likely to think that an only child who doesn't share their items with someone they're not the closest with is spoiled. However, when people grow up with siblings they don't trust, they might just end up being only children as lucky because they're not forced to share their stuff with siblings when they don't want to. Another comment on YouTube said that the spoiled part was foreign to me because I was an only child of a single parent who was struggling to make ends meet. I had to suck it up, focus, get great grades, and be the reason why my parents' struggle was all worth it. I didn't have the freedom to be flawed and make mistakes like kids with multiple siblings because the pressure was all on me. Something I think people talk about and is mostly more true as a stereotype is the pressure that only children face. There's only one child. Parents only get one shot with a child, and if a household isn't completely dysfunctional, they want this kid to succeed. Therefore, end up putting more pressure on them to do well in school and life. It is also often that the one kid is usually also responsible to look after their parents when they're older. So there's no splitting these large responsibilities with more than one person. I saw a comment on YouTube that said, "People with siblings actually get away with a lot more, precisely because parents have to split their attention between multiple children. Being an only child might mean that you're parented pretty closely, unless your parents' large concern was on staying afloat." Another comment said, "Yes, all the attention was on me," which means all the attention was on me, good and bad. all the praise and all the pressure. And my reward is to be the sole person in charge of my mum as she grows older and eventually passes away, leaving me alone in the world. Another one said, it almost felt like I didn't have the freedom to be flawed and make mistakes like kids with multiple siblings because the pressure was all on me and I absolutely could not disappoint. Another widely thought stereotype is that only children are very lonely, usually introverts, and struggle a lot socially. Talking from my perspective, I used to want a sibling when I was younger, an older brother or a twin. I actually had an imaginary twin brother. We don't talk about that. Anyway, I'm pulling out the lyrics from a song I really like called Only Child by Sasha Sloan. Some of the lyrics go, she'd be my built-in best friend right around my age. She would know how hard it's been because we grew up the same way. It gets lonely being an only child. I do think that most only children will feel the same way at some point in their lives. It would be nice to have someone live almost the same childhood as you and go through life with, at least until you move out of your parents' house. The idea that someone would know exactly how your life is at home is really tempting. I read a comment on YouTube that said, I know my status as an only child can make people kind of look at me as someone who knows how to be independent and self-sufficient, whatever, etc. While it is certainly a commendable personal trait, I can also say that at 51 years old, lonely isn't the dirty word a lot of folks make it out to be. It can be simply reality. I look back at decades of so-called friendships and other relationships, and there hasn't really been anything vaguely ride or die about any of them. Not because I ever chose that way for myself, because it's ingrained in me as an only child to be independent. It's just been an ongoing example of how hard things can be when your immediate family circle is naturally smaller than some and others are hard to pin down. I've come to accept that even as friends and other people might see me as someone fascinating to have a meaningless conversation with, no one has ever seen fit to attach their lives to mine and build a relationship that is real and goes beyond superficial. After decades of that, is it any wonder why some of us might admit to feeling very lonely? As you get older, you're left on the sidelines of your immediate peer group who are now involved with their own self-built immediate families. Now, this is not what I experienced. I personally developed really deep, meaningful friendships, and I think I can owe a lot of that to being an only child. I definitely feel there's a reason for this is because all my best friends are also only children and don't have a built-in best friend like Sasha Sloan calls it. So instead, we look for sibling-like close relationships outside of the home, like in friendships. I think it takes longer for an only child to open up because they need to completely trust you, which might make some of them be seen as quiet in the first interactions when they're really just being cautious. When I felt like I wanted a sibling, I already had 3 best friends who were also only children, and all of us, I'm pretty sure, went through the phase of wanting a sibling. But to be honest, since we had each other, we started to consider each other like sisters, and the need for it reduced. You can definitely have both kinds of only children. I've seen only children play out as introverts who like to spend their time alone and don't like socializing and much because they're used to not being surrounded by other children most of the time. But I've also seen extroverted only children who in fact make more effort to go out of their comfort zone and make friends because they enjoy socializing. So I couldn't find any data about how many only children there are in the world, but in the UK, a whopping 44% of households of the population have just 1 child. But in the US, it's only about 20%. I do think my friendships with only children tend to be a bit different from my friendships with non-only children. I saw a comment on Reddit that said I am 18 years old and I have yet to meet an only child from my generation other than an online friend that lives several states away. From what I've read, only 20% of the US population are only children, but I still find it crazy that throughout my whole life I haven't had a single friend or family member who grew up without siblings. It's quite a lonely world, and all my life I had just wished to have somebody I could relate to. However, another comment on Reddit points this out, that the statistic is that 20% of households with children have an only child. That means that the percentage of people who are only children is much smaller than that. Imagine there are 10 households in the world with children. If 2 households have only children, 6 of them have 2 kids, and 2 of them have 3 kids. That's 20 children in the 10 households. 2 of those 20 are only children. So only children only make up about 10% of the population in that example. So there are actually much lesser only children than the statistics make it seem. But from what I read in the replies, a large amount of only children said that they felt more closer to other only children because they related to them more. I do think that this would be a large generalization, which might be true for some only children and not true for others. I think sibling dynamics are also really complicated in the sense that sometimes if siblings have a large age gap, they tend to end up with traits more similar to only children. Or if only children have friends or cousins that they're really close with, they might end up with traits more similar to children with siblings. I don't think it's it's right to filter out friendships based on whether or not someone's an only child though. That's not something I've ever done in my life and don't think I would ever do. I have some close friendships with people who have siblings, and I also know some only children who have very close friendships with other people who have siblings. And I have no hate to people with or without siblings. I guess my point is that finding out that people might avoid friendship with only children because they're weird is just not right, and honestly, just don't judge someone based on their siblings or lack thereof, but their personality. I think more than being lonely, the way some only children would describe it is being independent. I do think that out of all the stereotypes, this is the most true to an extent if we ignore all the other social dynamics at play here. If I'm being honest, around a certain age, I started to love being an only child. When I was 16, I started to be more exposed to sibling dynamics, and I started to notice the older child syndrome and the younger child syndrome, and I kind of started to be grateful for not experiencing those complexes. Someone on the internet put being independent in such a great perspective that I had never thought of before. People ignore the fact that only children tend to be around adults more than their peers, which results in being privy to the adult world and conversations faster than people with siblings. Not to mention that you are adultified, but more so in the form of independence rather than having to help raise siblings. Another comment said that my friends with the most drama and worst relationships are the ones who can't stand to be alone, whereas I'm fine alone. I enjoyed visiting friends that had siblings, but I also enjoyed going home to peace and quiet where everything is mine. I had to make friends, whereas siblings are usually built-in friends. So this was me attempting to show you the very different perspectives of people who grew up being an only child and trying to debunk 4 very common labels associated with them. To end, I'd like to read a comment from Reddit that I related to the most. I think the message is very important. Has anyone ever found themselves perplexed by the built-in stereotypes people seem to have of only children? I grew up an only child, yet I'm often told by my friends and acquaintances that they wouldn't have guessed I grew up as an only child. But why? What exactly is an only child supposed to be anyways? While I've often wished I had a sibling or 2 to grow up with, it was ultimately not in the cards for me, so here I am, existing anyways. Despite being an only child, I have always found myself quite outgoing when I want to be, and perfectly content by myself when need be. I have a deep understanding of myself and how I think and see the world, and see no reason to reduce my worth down to whether or not my parents had more kids. I am what I am, and that's enough. Honestly, having no siblings in many ways has made me more outgoing. It made me more willing to seek out others and much more open-minded about the people I've let into my life. It makes me constantly have to reach outside of my comfort zone, and that has helped me build a lot of strength, confidence, and resilience. Be proud of what you are. There is no perfect family. Find one that fits you. That's my app for today. I hope you learned a bit about what it's like being an only child and that we're not just weird loners. If you're an only child, comment below what your experiences have been as an only child and the story times of when you've been told, but you don't seem like an only child. And if you're not an only child, keep your only children friends close. I'm going to try to post more often, so hopefully I'll see you around if you stick around. Bye!